Late in the evening, Thomas sat in his small apartment, scrolling through the news on his phone. The night was quiet, the city outside the windows was silent, and only the light of the table lamp illuminated the room. Everything was going on as usual, until his phone vibrated. An unknown number appeared on the screen. Thomas frowned. Who could it be at this time, he thought, but curiosity forced him to answer. "Hello?" he said, slightly irritated. A whisper answered him. Quiet, barely audible, but completely clear. "Thomas?" The voice said his name, stretching out his letter. "Who is it?" he asked, slightly startled. The whisper continued. The words were incomprehensible, as if spoken in a foreign language, but his name was repeated over and over. The sound was strange, as if it was coming not from the phone, but right in his head. "I don't hear your name much." "Stop joking," Thomas shouted and hung up. He threw the phone on the table and took a deep breath, trying to calm down. This is probably just someone's prank, he thought. But inside, he was still worried. A few minutes passed and the phone vibrated again. The same number was on the screen. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. This time he didn't answer, but the vibration didn't stop. Thomas silenced the phone, but it didn't help. The calls continued, monotonous vibrations filling the room like the ticking of a clock, growing louder in his mind. He couldn't take it anymore and picked up the phone again. "What do you want? Who are you?" he shouted, clutching the phone so tightly that his fingers turned white. This time the whisper was closer, clearer. The voice seemed to penetrate his mind, repeating his thoughts. "Who are you?" he heard himself echoing, spoken in an unfamiliar tone. Thomas froze. "Is this some kind of trick?" he whispered, but the voice immediately repeated after him, almost simultaneously. "Is this some kind of trick?" End quote. The whisper became more and more insistent, drowning out his own thoughts. There was a creepy mockery in it, as if the voice was playing with him, imitating him, and at the same time anticipating his words. At some point he realized that the voice was not simply repeating, it knew what Thomas had not yet managed to say. "You think this is a prank?" the voice interrupted his thoughts. Thomas gasped, not believing his ears. "What?" he croaked, feeling his heart pound in panic. "I know what you're thinking, Thomas," the voice whispered, no longer coming from the phone, but from the very air around him. He looked around, trying to understand what was happening. His gaze darted around the room, but it was empty. However, the air had become heavier, and the silence rang so that it seemed deafening. He tried to shake it off, but it couldn't be shaken off. The silence was so deafening. "You think I'm somewhere far away," the voice continued, "but I'm right behind you." Thomas froze. His back went cold. His heart started beating faster, but he didn't dare turn around. There was a quiet creaking sound in the air, as if something was moving on the floor behind his chair. He slowly turned his head, but saw no one. "Don't turn around," the voice whispered, now right next to his ear. Determined to remain conscious, the man fought her attempts. Thomas couldn't take it anymore. A chill ran through his body, his heart was pounding. Everything inside him was screaming, "Don't look back." But he couldn't resist. Slowly, with trembling hands, he turned his head. What he saw made his breath stop. In the chair behind him, he was sitting himself, or rather, his body. His eyes were open, but lifeless, like glass. His face was pale, with a frozen expression of horror. In his hands, he was clutching a phone, the screen of which was still glowing. Thomas choked. His mind could not accept what he saw. He took a step back, not taking his eyes off this terrible scene. "No, it can't be," he whispered, but the words did not come out. The body in the chair did not move, but the phone in his hand suddenly vibrated. Thomas saw an incoming call appear on the screen. The number was familiar to him. It was his own number. "Who are you?" he asked hoarsely, not noticing that the whisper was now coming straight from his lips. The body in the chair suddenly raised its head, and their eyes met. Thomas's face was distorted into a terrible, inhuman smile, and his eyes seemed to look straight into his soul. "It is you," it said, in a voice that was no longer his. It was so large, almost the size of the man. It was all white. The room around him began to dissolve. Everything went dark, and the voice that had been sounding in his head became a roar, drowning out all thoughts. The last thing he realized was that his own body was now left here, in this silence. He had become nothing, an empty echo of the voice that would call the next victim.